Hi, I'm Joshua Hashemzadeh, the curator of Semblance Sunshine at the Torrance Art Museum, and I'm here with Roy Thurston, one of our artists here in the exhibition. Thank you so much for being here with us, Roy. I'd love to see more of the studio and understand more of what you have going on. I wish we could be in person, but unfortunately, I think these are the circumstances that we're dealing with.
Well, and this gives you something to show the people that can't go or won't go to the museum. So,
this exhibition focuses a lot on industrial materials and materials that are maybe a little bit removed from the kind of Eurocentric traditions that people kind of associate with painting. But you yourself are very much a painter, and I'm wondering, for you, how did these kind of material decisions, come about in your work, and maybe you can explain a little bit how that plays a role within your practice.
well, probably if I just explained the history a certain amount, then things would become clear. When I was in graduate school, for my graduate project, I worked on a series of paintings on paper that I was increasing the transparency of the paper with mineral oil, just by painting mineral oil on it, some pencil lines, a little bit of color, but most of the color was in colored pencil on the back of the paper. So by putting the mineral oil on, the color could just come through in the most subtle way, in a way that you couldn't have put it on any other way. Unfortunately, those paintings were really sensitive. A little bit of dirt, a smudge, a fingerprint, and they were pretty much gone. And then it turned out, over a period of time, the mineral oil, of course, does not harden. It's just oil, and it doesn't oxidize really either. It's very stable, and it keeps spreading. So at a certain point, it spread out of where it was supposed to.
Live and learn, I guess.
Yeah, we'll learn 3 years later. And so I made those paintings for a while after graduate school, but because they didn't last, because they were so sensitive, I stopped working on it that way. One of the big things that happened was my girlfriend at the time was roller skating around inside the house and lost her balance and put her hand on the painting. And
oh, geez. Oh, man. Like slapstick.
And of course, this was in a tiny room, too. It was about 10 feet wide, probably 11 feet long. So she was rolling around in circles. But then she realized what she had done, and she kissed the painting in order to heal it. There was a big lipstick mark. And I didn't get mad. I just realized, you know what? I got to do a better job with this.
I love that that's the takeaway.
So that sent me off in a completely different direction. And that also got me using things that I was more comfortable with. I made a couple of easel paintings when I was in college on canvas or on just a cheap board of one sort or another. And of course, all that stuff got lost somewhere along the line. And then the paper paintings, which I still have most of them, are just essentially destroyed. So I started working with industrial materials that just seem to be much more stable and cleanable on one thing or the next. So I've always endeavored to make my work easily retouched or preservable, and really never used artist materials after college. So I was pretty familiar with a couple of different paint systems, lacquers, and more recently with acrylic polyurethane. So I've actually also always worked flat, which kind of invites industrial materials as well. And then the more recent,
that last part, you said you always worked what?
Flat.
Oh, flat.
Yeah, I haven't worked on a vertical surface in 40 years or so.
Oh, wow.
So, and then, for instance, in your practice, do you ever work flat? Maybe for little details, you put the thing flat.
I definitely do. I mean, working with resins and things, I mean, all of that I think you're right. Like industrial materials, they're not meant to be, worked on that.
Or it's easier to
Yeah.
work flat sometimes. So
No, I definitely see what you mean, but I love how practical that decision was for you. It's just my girlfriend is doing this. The oil is not sustainable. I can't do this. I gotta just switch it. It wasn't, that's
and then over the years I've been in collections where other artists in the collection made very beautiful, very delicate work. Patricia Moysan used to make things. If I've seen David McAuliffe ruin one of those paintings by just picking it up from the edges ever so slightly wrong, and the painting was ruined just by touching the edge of it. So, or Günter Umberg, if you know, he's a European painter. If you know his work, that generally on the wall pukes off pigment all the time. So if you're a collector, you better not put it over a carpet because you're going to have dark pigment in your. And again, that's a painting that if you touched any one of those, they would be ruined. So, from an early time, it just seemed important to me to.
no, that's interesting. And so metal specifically though became like a big, sort of through line in terms of the practice, like the substrate that you've used. And I know that you've obviously applied silicone and other materials to that. But your experience as a metal worker is pretty extensive. Was that something that you had, inclination for in school and stuff, or how did that relationship to metal specifically develop?
Well, again, a little bit of history would shed pretty much complete light on that. My father was a aeronautical engineer and had airplane type manufacturing going on most of my childhood he was a consultant later in life, but up until I was about 35 or so, he was manufacturing aircraft parts or aircraft. And in the summers I worked in the shop. I started off, he, of course, an engineer, wanted me to be an engineer. I started off in the drafting room and I lasted about 2 weeks, and he was in agreement that I should actually be doing something else because for whatever reason, my hands are really oily and I just get smudge marks all over everything. I'm not a particularly neat worker. So I talked my way out into the shop pretty quickly. And then that was just a wonderland
Wow,
sheet metal working equipment and aluminum. So
that's amazing. Yeah, it's been there then your whole life.
yeah, from like the age of 15.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, working with it, I mean, from the age of 15. So
yeah.
so
No,
when I was in college, I was making things for the professors because, oh yeah, I know how to do that. I'll help you with that. So, and then using it in my own work, it actually really only came out in the early 90s when I was working at the Warner Brothers Museum on the lot in Burbank, and was doing preparation for all the objects. James Dean's jeans, for instance. Elizabeth Taylor's dress, things like that, that they had Batman and stuff. And they had hired a large exhibition company to prepare all of the bases and, probably a couple $100,000 contract. And then some of the things got damaged in shipment. Things were made in Texas and shipped. So they gave me a couple of gallons of the paint that they had used, which was a complete revolution for me because it was contemporary 2-component paint that was super high performing. And also part of the paint system was a mechanism for adhering a series of preparation steps that made things adhere to aluminum. I was actually starting to paint on aluminum with lacquer, clear lacquer or slightly colored lacquer. But given a couple of months, lacquer continues to dry and it would shrink and then it would finally just peel off the aluminum. But this other paint system had a really good clear and a good clear primer for aluminum. So all of a sudden I was actually able to make things using the surface of the aluminum is kind of the heart of the painting with color on top of it. So That
Yeah,
all came about is the usual fluke of working with stuff, and all of a sudden, hey, look at this stuff.
yeah. I think like I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I think so often when you think about someone working in a metal shop or a woodworker or something like that, like the materials are so sculptural that it often dictates the piece to be sculpture or seen in that regard. But you've always maintained a very I think driven approach to thinking this work as painting. And I'm wondering, like, was there an aha moment for you that you were kind of deciding between how to identify this object, or how you were thinking about it? Was it once you started using those lacquers?
Well, I mean, the way I identify painting is a certain kind of thing made to be seen in a certain kind of way. That's more or less my definition of it. I know that lots of people think that my work is sculptural, but I actually also made a decision a long time ago to bring as many attributes of sculpture into my painting as possible. But I'm really asking people to consider my painting, whatever you want to call them, my things on the wall, from a painter's point of view of surface, texture, view angle, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they're obviously sculptural attributes, but that's all been done on purpose to try to up the ante.
Like that.
Whatever that might mean in contemporary art. Plugging it in, yeah, let's do that.
Hey, that experimentation I think is super important. But it's interesting that you talk about having it seen that certain way or incorporating those materials, which I think you know LA in general. I think the works that are produced here, there is that kind of like in between in terms of how it's been classified and how people have responded to it. I'm wondering if when you were in school, then leading up through the sort of series of events that you mentioned that kind of brought you to like the early resemblance of what you're doing now. Were there other artists that you were looking at in the decade prior or around the time that you were working? Were there contemporaries that were investigating things similarly that you were looking at?
Well, again, history sheds a lot of light on that. I grew up in New England, and I went to college in Colorado. But before I ever went to Colorado, I had seen the Whitney Biennial in, it might have been 67 or 68 or 67 going into 68, somewhere in there, before I had gone to Colorado. And in that biennial, there were a few pieces by Robert Graham and a piece or two by Dwayne Valentine.
Okay.
And I know I was just completely blown away. I've been interested in constructivist art of the 30s and use of aluminum and plexiglass, and I've made some really shitty sculptures out of plexiglass in high school even. But the West Coast artists just had an openness to color and material that just really wasn't shown in anything that was made in New York or on the East Coast. So
Sure.
in a funny way, as a kid, even in the woods of Maine, watching TV, it was like, oh yeah, California.
Yeah, no, I think
So even as a 9-year-old, watching whatever it was, Spin and Marty or Roy Rogers or something like that, there was just a whiff of California that I'd gotten early on, or Walt Disney or Mickey Mouse or whatever it was on TV back in those days, and then to see that the artists were more experimental, I guess I would say, or maybe more open, or just ready to use whatever satisfied their requirements at the moment. Whereas New York always seemed like a more closed shop to me. I spent a little time in New York in the very early 70s, but quickly realized that I wasn't going to make my way in New York anyway. So
yeah.
graduate school in Colorado, in California.
No, and I think that makes sense, and it's funny because I've spoken with other artists too, and there's always this just like intuition about, I guess, how one relates to work in California, and that's kind of been true across decades and generations. I think there's certain things that people are just drawn to out here, and the environment kind of provokes this kind of reaction through these art objects.
Well, in the artist community, there's no real party line, and there's nothing that you have to do, and you'll find that your artist friends might be doing fairly different work than you are.
For sure.
But they're really interested in what you're doing, just because they're more open-minded. My experience of looking over my artist friends' shoulders and who moved to New York or living in New York or on the East Coast and other places, it's just there's less support for things that are marginal. There's lots of marginal stuff in LA. So
minimalism, like within the context of history, like we started seeing that become more prolific, like in the 1960s on both coasts. You were seeing that in multiple ways, and obviously many artists were taking that on. But there was a very distinct ethos in California that I think was more open-ended. And yet New York, although they were coming from that sort of academic, institutional lens, I just think it's fascinating that both coasts were operating in a similar fashion, and yet the same kind of aesthetic could hold multiple meanings and multiple approaches. And I'm wondering if there was anything about that you found interesting at the time.
I wouldn't say too much about my own work in that time period, because I was trying to figure out my way forward. So I didn't really have any particular qualification of what my work was like. But again, maybe a little bit of my history would elucidate matters. So after I trashed the idea of working on paper, it took me a while to move forward, and I was working on hard surfaces, and I was just trying to figure out what the minimum thing that I could do was with the minimum thing I could do that would deliver some kind of a painting experience. So that took a long time, a big stack of plywood with lacquer on it that was just junk ideas that was like, okay, that doesn't work and this doesn't work. And finally I started to move forward. But so that was kind of my attachment to minimalism. Isn't a mental attitude. It was just where do I start attitude. And to the extent that I haven't really added other colors to the work that I do on purpose. In other words, there's no two contrasting colors, and there's no two related colors, except by the kind of shape that they might be on, creating a color difference. I just have never gotten beyond working on what turned out to be a very large area for me to explore. But to put a little bit more light on all of that, and again, my impression of New York in the 60s, early 70s, in reading and being there, in going to museums or whatever, is that there was kind of a party line. There was there was a couple of very powerful voices, Donald Judd, Clement Greenberg, critics, artists that had manifestos and whatever else, all of which I found completely inscrutable. And it was I've never read Donald Judd, get about the third page and go, whoa, no.
Not about that manifesto life.
Yeah. But in fact, I've got a very funny thing that many years later, this was in the middle 90s, went to the Cincinnati Foundation Oktoberfest, whatever it is that Donald Judd was running, and he was there that year, and I went with my friend Kirk, and Kirk is a friend from both college and graduate school, and Kirk is interested in things that are funky, unusual, and he knew about going to Marfa, Texas. He knew about the Marfa Mystery Lights as well as about the Cincinnati Foundation. So the Marfa Mystery Lights are, do you know, does that ring a bell, the Marfa Mystery Lights?
The Marfa Mystery, no, but I know his installation in Marfa.
Yes, but the Cincinnati Foundation Oktoberfest was about artists getting together at the installation of his pieces uh,
Oh, okay.
there. But the Marfa Mystery Lights were a phenomenon that was occasionally seen by willing people out east of town if you went on the right day and stopped at the right place and looked in the right direction. And so we went out there the first night with Kirk's binoculars, and poof, there were the Marfa Mystery Lights. Well, I've been an amateur astronomer since I was a little kid, and I had never seen anything like it, and I could not characterize them in any way, except that both Kirk and I were seeing them and watching them for about an hour with some other people along the edge of the road. So the next day we talked to Donald Judd about that, who'd been there on and off for probably 15 years at that point. And he's like, oh no, there are no Marfa Mystery Lights. That's all just horseshit and whatever else. Hey, I don't know what to say. But that was my experience relative to, I mean, that's a kind of a fact and a metaphor about my attitude towards New York art of the 60s. It's like, there's other things that we should be considering here.
I like that, just like alternative,
There should be, no nothing that you can't do. So
yeah, I think so much of that New York school like had this almost authoritative, mantra to their work. It was odd to me where I think California, for me, at least when I was studying in undergrad and through my curation, that mode of experimentation, that mode of like just wanderlust and all that in California, and you can see that in the work. I think it's enjoyable more on a human level than it is on an academic level, maybe in some regards. And you mentioned in one of our conversations, I think you said a quality that you'll find in a lot of LA art around that time and this kind of subsequent aesthetic is that there's always something that's funky to it. There's always something that's like slightly, quirky or funky.
I think that particularly characterizes sculpture west of the Mississippi for the last 40 years.
Yeah.
It's really hard to think of something that doesn't have a little quirk to it. You think of Peter Alexander's plastic sculpture. There's always something just a little bit awry. It's not Donald Judd pure. It's got a softness to it. So the resin is a little cloudy on the inside or whatever. Or Fred Eversley piece is, very, very sophisticated engineering wise, but always has a little bit of funkmation to it. So
do you feel that that's equally true within your practice?
It's built into a lot of the stuff that I do, but whether people read it that way or not, I'm not quite so sure. I think that people see that there's a severe side to what I do that is
severe side. I like that.
Maybe austere side, but
yeah.
There's often stuff, maybe even on the back of the painting. I spend almost as much time on hanging equipment as they do.
I've seen that. You're meticulous with that. I mean, like, it's really impressive. And even when you're installing the works, I mean, everything has been completely mapped. I think like there is huge austerity in that, and then like you look at it, and
it's easier for me to do it that way. That's all.
Yeah, no, for us too. When we have it in a museum or a show, it's totally appreciated. But I love that you have that kind of like harshness and like practicality, and then you also have that coupled with pink silicone. It's like and to have that kind of duality within a piece and have that play between materials and between textures and how that engages light throughout so much of your work. I always thought was really interesting and a big draw to not only how they look in a gallery but also how you're making them.
Well, the silicone came about kind of very slowly for years. I don't know, does the artist Albert Pinkham Ryder mean anything to you? Does that name ring a bell?
I don't think it does.
He was an obscure painter in New York, completely self-taught, kind of a nut. And this is the middle of the 19th century. And he was enamored of things that you could do with the artist's materials or the materials that were available at that time, which were more or less oil paint related, so that they were basically tree resins and tree thinners and things that were, so to the extent that turpentine is a rendered pine pitch or a pine resin, and balsam resin is water clear, thick substance that will slowly harden. He was making these jewel-like things, mostly marine paintings, where the moon was shining through the water and there was a boat shape or something like that. They were kind of crude. They were, as far as their shape were concerned, but I think in the moment when they were made, they must have been jewel-like with unbelievable colors. But of course, these were also materials that he was using in completely inappropriate ways. And so all of the clear stuff turned to, blood colors,
Oh my God.
obscure, and some of them were so heavily painted. There's a famous one where there's a boat on a wave with a fisherman or oarsman in it, and the boat over a period of about 20 years sunk to the bottom of the canvases were usually small, sunk to the bottom upside down and rested on the frame. It couldn't go anywhere else. And then the whole painting turned kind of burned pecan pie colored. But just the idea of those things stuck with me many years ago. Ooh, what were these like when they were new? They were clear.
Right.
And you couldn't even do them with polyester resin back in the day because polyester isn't clear enough. Polyurethane resins are nowadays, or urethane resins can be clear, but they're hard. I wanted to make something, for a long time I wanted to make something that I could put on with a palette knife or a drywall tool or something like that that was clear. Right. And I could never figure out how to do that. I worked on it every once in a while. And then one day in one of my technical magazines that I subscribed to,
hey,
they were showing something they had no idea about, which was a catalyzed silicone. They had no idea that there was a whole realm of things that have been around for years and years, which was clear silicone that was a two-component system. And a lot of the systems that I was trying to work with were solvent systems, and so they would shrink, and you always had all these problems with things cracking or whatever else. But the silicone just hardens, doesn't shrink at all, maybe a percent or two. So as soon as I discovered that, that's when I started working with trying to figure out how to make things with a silicone that I could actually apply as a clear paste. I haven't gotten there yet, but I'm making progress.
I like that's
always technical problems with that. I guess what I'm saying is that a lot of this is an exploration of materials, but materials are always in service of things that I've wanted to do. I just didn't quite know how to do. So.
Absolutely, and I think like that investigative process, like it's what keeps the work fresh too. The longer you engage with it, because not only are you mastering it, but you're discovering new ways to use it, through time. And maybe next time you get a magazine, you'll have a whole new approach, like to how to do something. It's like, you never know where the inspiration's going to come from. That's great. I do think, like, thinking about that silicone and specifically the piece in the show, I've seen it now a couple times in your studio, then through some reproductions from other exhibits, and then now in the space at the Torrance Art Museum. And I remember the first time I was coming to see it at your studio, you were very specific about coming at a time within the afternoon where the light was correct for the piece. And I think, like so many of the artists, within that time, and also just working in LA, the quote unquote light and space has always played kind of true to that. And I think that's been maybe our most like go-to label for how to describe like a sort of California aesthetic, in the sort of academia realm. I'm wondering if you can maybe talk about, the role of light within your work, but then also I know that you have some criticism as to how maybe perhaps limiting a phrase like that can be for artists that are working, in really diverse ways within LA.
Well, I'm afraid of a couple of the terms that are used there. I mean, I know that we banned the phrase finish fetish around, and that's I don't know any artist that thinks that that's a handy term. That's a term that comes out of car or motorcycle restoration or,
Right.
customization, and, used by one of the LA Times art critics back in the day. But the the implication of it, fetishizing the finish, is appropriate, I think, to customizing a motorcycle gas tank,
Right.
where there's no real aesthetic involved with it except for the craziness of the color or maybe the craziness of the metal flake in it or whatever else. But in order for it to work, it's got to be kind of perfect, so it gets fetishized that way. But I don't think artists work that way. Artists just use stuff to get the effect that they want, so that there's a looser quality in all of the artist stuff, and it's not well served by that phrase. Also, my quibble with light and space, just used in a relaxed way, I think that is a very specific term that applies to 6 or 8 artists, and that's it. And a few of them are still working, and a few of them have died at this point. And the aesthetic was really anti-object in its beginning. It was based partially on painting is dead, sculpture is dead. We are going to make experiences. We are not going to make objects. So that's a big dose of the meaning of light and space. So those of us that are object makers might be informed by light and space things, but aren't really light and space artists.
That's super well put. And I think, looking at this show and having worked with you and several other artists, in our Reverb exhibition some time ago, you really start to see how diverse, artists are in LA. And even though, like you said, they may take inspiration from some of the historical, approaches and thinking within the city, it does kind of limit the understanding when you start using it like in that sort of general sense. And so for this show, really coming in and seeing how each practice can kind of embellish those initial like influences, but really take them into their own regard, was something I was hoping, that we could highlight for each artist, because I know, like yourself, you're very object oriented, and so many of the other, sculptors and painters within the show are. And I think that's sometimes the danger you run when your history is really dictated by the press to a certain extent.
Yes, exactly. And the press, strangely enough, never seemed bothered to contact the artist and have this kind of a conversation with the artist. What are you doing?
There's no fact checking back then.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And there's plenty of facts, so, but, in the way I divvy up the constellation of things that are often heaped in there, is that there's plastic sculptors, and there's light and space artists, and then there's people that are doing things that are informed by both of those pursuits, but maybe they're painters then. So, so there.
No, I like that. I'm just curious, so within your work, because I've seen now several bodies working, even behind you, I'm noticing a couple of things that I maybe hadn't seen before.
Well, you're seeing a couple of Carl Benjamins on either side of my head. And then in the second room there's a yellow, let's see, right wherever it is, right there is the silicone piece in the next room.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I was wondering, in terms of works that you're working on now, if there's anything that you want to highlight about, things that you're working on now, or maybe upcoming projects.
Well, I had a failure of a major bulk of painting a couple of months ago, and I haven't quite gotten over that yet. So I haven't done anything in a few months. I'm waiting for the day when I'm feeling inspired. I have an idea about how to save it, but otherwise it's, $2,000 worth of silicone down the drain.
Oh, no.
And I know that once I start trying to save it, I just will not do anything else for a couple of days. So just trying to get to where I feel like, okay, today's the day to start on this.
No, absolutely. Well, I wish I could say, with all the artists, that we can go and enjoy the show and see it in person. But I think these online meetings and thumbnails are going to be the best that we get. But I do really appreciate you taking the time to talk about the exhibition with us.
Well, I appreciate your interest and remembering all of this stuff too. I mean, the things that I'd said months ago that I'd forgotten about. Well, there's that. It's good. I appreciate that.
Absolutely, yeah. It's been hugely educational for me, and I think as a younger artist too, picking up on a lot of these kind of aesthetic traditions and understanding where they come from, and not just
there's no doubt that the Los Angeles art scene is poorly understood by anybody other than the artists in Los Angeles. The collectors have not done a very good job of understanding it, I don't think. Collectors in Los Angeles. I think that with a few very notable exceptions, there's curators and others that have taken only a surface interest of a few of the more well-known artists in Los Angeles, and there's a lot of people here working with painting and sculpture and installation, on, and they just get no recognition, and there's a lot of work that is worthy of attention. So
absolutely,
and it's also really lacking any kind of written critical overview and a good book about Los Angeles.
For sure. I mean,
absolutely lacking. So
yeah, in just my studies for this, I mean, I think there was the Pacific Standard Time show, and then there was it, which largely leaned on Finnish fetish and light and space terms and that kind of 1960s understanding. But even beyond 1960, yeah, I mean, I really
from 1960 or before 1960.
I'm saying after 1960. Yeah. In terms of like the history that was recorded within LA and how accurate that was, I found it totally lacking, in the shows that I've done so far. And I think the best resource that I've come across, like you said, is really the artists themselves. The testimonials of the work that they're making, and also the artists that they were looking at. And I'm hoping like this show, and along with some of the other things that we've collaborated on, that they can kind of serve as a stepping stone for more of that activity to take place, hopefully in the future.
Yeah. And I guess I'm also talking about it. Maybe I'm largely talking about it, haven't said it, but in the back of my mind, it's all about advocacy for Los Angeles. There have been very few effective advocates. So.
Well, I was born and raised here, so if I'm hoping to take some of that responsibility.
Okay, good. We're going to give it to you.
I appreciate that. On that note, Roy, thank you so much for taking the time today. And
this has been my pleasure, so I really appreciate this.
Yeah, and hopefully when things normalize, we will have another studio visit and catch up in person.
Excellent.